Good evening. My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I am the International Affairs Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this Ambassador Series program. Special thanks to our strategic partners, the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center, for the use of this beautiful space to host our public programs. These are filmed for our television show, World Affairs Today, and are available on our YouTube channel and other digital platforms. Today, we welcome to our podium Her Excellency, Dr. Arikana Chihombori Quao, Ambassador of the African Union Mission to the United States. Founded in 1999, the African Union has 55 member states and was created for the purpose of improving the economic, social, and political institutions of African states, as well as to counter the negative effects of colonialism and globalization in Africa. The AU does this by promoting African economic interests abroad, encouraging the self-determination of African people, increasing the presence and participation of African states in global organizations, and improving political institutions. The United States and the African Union officially established diplomatic relations in 2006. In 2007, the African Union mission to the US was opened, and it became the first bilateral diplomatic mission established by the AU. Our discussant for the program, Ambassador Herman Cohen, has a long career in diplomacy and the U.S. Foreign Service. He served as U.S. Ambassador to the Republics of Senegal and the Gambia from 1977 to 1980. He was on the National Security Council during the Ronald Reagan administration. He helped to negotiate conflict resolutions in Angola, Mozambique, and Ethiopia. He also participated in negotiations for transition of power in South Africa and Namibia. Ambassador Cohen served as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs during the President George H.W. Bush administration. He is currently President and CEO of Cohen & Woods International. Her Excellency, Dr. Arikana Chihombori Quao, was appointed as Ambassador to the African Union Mission to the United States in 2017. Her Excellency is internationally recognized as a philanthropist and advocate for improved healthcare systems and women's rights. In 2015, she was awarded the Women of Excellence Award at the 25th African Union Summit. She is one of 15 women to ever receive the award. In 2013, she was one of 4 women to represent Africa at the International Conference on Women's Rights in Argentina. Since 2012, Her Excellency has been the chair of the African Union African Diaspora Health Initiative, where she has worked to bring healthcare professionals to Africa for collaboration on managing healthcare issues. Prior to becoming ambassador, Her Excellency was a doctor of family medicine, practicing in Murfreesboro, Tennessee for the last 25 years. Please join me in giving me a warm welcome to Ambassador Herman Cohen and Ambassador Dr. Arikana Chihombori Quao.
Having me. My apologies for my raspy voice. I'm getting over a really bad cold. On Saturday, I couldn't speak at all. Needless to say, my husband was very happy that for a change, he did all the talking. Ambassador Cohen, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you all. I bring you greetings from the 1.2 billion Africans, along with our 55 heads of states. As I have traveled around, not only in this country, but also on the continent, I'm amazed at how much people just don't know who the African Union is. And I'm gonna put my young daughter, who just spoke about the AU having been formed in '99. I'm gonna correct that. We're gonna go to the beginning of how we came together as Africans. The first ever known union of any African states was in 1958. This is when the colonial masters were giving up their colonies. As you all know, most of Africa was colonized by the British and the French. The French gave their colonies 2 choices. You can be independent with no attachments to France, or you can be independent with some attachments to France. They never really expected any African country to not want to be affiliated to France. But to their surprise, Guinea and Mali said, "Thank you, France, it's been wonderful, but it's time to go home." So this, of course, absolutely infuriated the French. And in their anger, history tells us that they went in, took everything that they thought they had brought to Africa, including the last teaspoon and the last chair. They proceeded to pour concrete into the sewage pipes, completely devastating the two economies. The then newly appointed president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, in his efforts to help these two economies, created the first ever known union of any African states, which was Ghana, Guinea, and Mali. A few years later, a few states met in Morocco, and a few more met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. By 1963, our Pan-African leaders decided that it was time that Africa begins to come together and rebuild that which was destroyed by the Geneva Convention of, the Berlin Conference of 1885. As some of you might remember, the Berlin Conference, that is when, after our colonial masters had traveled around the breadth of the continent, found amazing, powerful kingdoms with educational systems and religious systems, that they felt that the only way to truly conquer Africa was to make the Africans believe that everything that is African was bad and that everything was Western was better, particularly British. So by 1885, during the Berlin Conference, colonial masters pulled out the map of Africa. The more powerful a kingdom was, the more countries that came out of it. You take a country like DRC, it's surrounded by 9 countries. It gave birth to countries like Togo, Burundi, Rwanda, Benin, economies that clearly cannot survive on their own. It was all by design to make sure that Africa is indeed a truly defeated continent. Now fast forward to 1963, when our colonial masters, having realized that the only way we can survive as Africans, the only way that we can claim our rightful place on the world stage is to unite. So they made and created what was then known OAU, which stood for Organization of African Unity. It is during that formative meeting that Kwame Nkrumah proclaimed that you are not African because you were born in Africa, but rather you are African because Africa is born in you. You see, being African is a spirit. You just have to know it to see it. In addition, he also claimed that Africa was for the Africans and the African Union was now. Those words are as relevant now as they were then. By 2002, OAU was renamed AU as we know it today, which stands for African Union. The leaders meet twice a year to discuss issues pivotal to the continent. Recently, we just left the summit. We're talking about single African aid market. We're talking about the continental free trade area. One would then want to know, why is it that 54 years later, after the Pan-African leaders had realized the need for Africa to come together, why is it that the Africans have not attained that perfect African Union? Let's go back to Berlin Conference, 1885, and that seed of divide and conquer. I wish I could stand in front of you today and tell you that that seed is dead. Sadly, it is alive and well. Let me bring it home a little bit. Let's look at the other ethnic groups in the world, even here in the United States. Look at the Indian diaspora. They're organized, they're doing amazing things for their countries of origin in India. Let's look at the Jews. A small country like Israel is a humongous strongest country because of its people. Its tentacles are all over the globe. They work together when it comes to issues to do with Israel. The Mexicans, the Chinese, the Irish, their voices are loud and clear. But when you ask for the voices of the African people, we are nowhere to be found. We can't even get along as people from the same country right here in the DMV. And we wonder why. Why is it that we're not able to create that perfect union? You see, my brother here, who cannot be part of a stronger bond in the DMV, tomorrow he's the president of his country of birth. He's going to take with him that mentality of me and failure to believe in myself and in each other. And that's why, to this day, we still struggle to build that perfect African Union. What are some of the challenges? As you all know, Africa is the richest continent in the world. And it is the original continent. Some of you may not be aware, but the original continent was called Pangea, P-A-N-G-E-A. That's when the world was one. Through tectonic shifts, the rest of the continents kind of drifted off. And the one continent that never moved is Africa, which is why it is the birthplace of all humanity, which is why Africa is endowed with everything and anything that the world can ever need. That is a fact. Africa is the place where the rest of the world is looking for anything they want. I can comfortably say, for the most part, strategic planning processes by most countries start with, what can we get out of Africa? The question then becomes, why is it that the richest continent on earth is the poorest? The continent where the sun shines brightest over the equator is labeled as the dark continent. Why is it that the continent that has everything is labeled as diseased and dying and is constantly at war with itself? But wars from a continent that does not manufacture guns, and yet we have an endless supply of guns. Where are they coming from? Well, the answer is very simple. You see, a stable Africa can dictate the cost of its goods. A stable Africa can take its rightful place on the world stage. A stable Africa cannot be exploited. Those are some of the realities that we have to deal with as we try to build that perfect union. Now, we do have our own issues internally. We got issues of democracy and good governance. Central region, for example. We have issues of terrorism. We got Boko Haram, we got Lord Resistance Army, we got ISIS. We are clearly not in a position to fight some of these challenges, particularly when we continue to be functioning as individual countries. The AU is working very hard to push the agenda of not only regional integration, but continental integration. Our fight against terrorism is like fetching water with a leaking bucket, with Libya being a completely open corridor, while the war against ISIS is being won in the Middle East. Guess where those terrorists are going? They're coming through Libya into Africa. We got 3,000 kilometers of the Mediterranean unprotected. We got more thousands of kilometers onto the Sahara Desert. They're just coming right through, and it is a very difficult challenge. You take that with the youth unemployment, it is a mecca for the terrorists to come and continue to exploit what Africa has. And you saw what happened in Libya with people being sold. So we have our own issues internally as Africans, the issues of corruption and good governance. African Union is doing the best it can. The Commissioner for Peace and Security, I call him the single-handed fireman. He's all over, running all over Africa, trying to negotiate and putting fires here and there. It's work in progress. But be it as it may, I can comfortably say we're beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to us coming together and building that perfect African Union which we desire, and for a change, us coming together and building the Africa that we want, not the Africa that others want. An Africa that can no longer continue to be exploited, an Africa that can recognize value in its own raw materials. We take 60% of the world cocoa is out of Africa, and yet we don't manufacture cocoa products, but we do consume them. It has gotten down to shea butter, for example. That's a consequentially African product, African woman. You must have your shea butter. Now, the shea butter is coming here, it's going to Europe, it's getting repackaged, sent back to Africa, and now we're buying it again. It's insanity of the highest order. And I stand here to say, we own that, because that should not be happening. Now, there are other more difficult mountains to climb. France is a serious issue for Africa. Hundreds of billions of dollars are going to France every year. Some of you may not be aware. All the minerals discovered and yet to be discovered in Francophone countries belong to France. All the oil discovered and yet to be discovered belongs to France. And the Francophone countries, they get royalties. That level of insanity has got to stop. But at some point, it takes also the African standing up. You see, if we continue to think and behave and act in a colonized way, what goes in comes out as colonized actions. I like to use a simple example. If two brothers were going to fetch water, one is black, sell water. One is black and one is white. The black brother is on one side of the street, the white brother is on the other. The black people, I challenged them. I said, whose water are you going to buy? Our colonized minds will automatically drift us towards the white brother's water because his water is better, because he's white. That mentality, until we cleanse ourselves. I was in Jamaica going through a resort, and four of us, all of us black, we were actually six, and my godson and his girlfriend, my godson is black Jamaican, with his white girlfriend, were in a car behind us. So we were heckled at the gate. Do you have a VIP pass? And the Jamaican friend of mine says, well, I'm the VIP. And no, you can park there, you can park there. So we got ushered off to the side. And we had to walk all the way down to the reception area. We just wanted to have a drink. Well, the young couple behind us with a raggedy old car, we're driving almost a spanking new SUV, that didn't matter. With their raggedy old car, the next thing we know, they went through. So when we went down there, we were like, how did you get through? We were together. You don't have a VIP pass? And the Jamaican guy just busted out laughing. He said, well, he had his VIP pass sitting next to him. But the reality is that mentality, we have got to cleanse ourselves of that disease. No amount of education, no degree can cleanse us of that. We have got to wake up as Africans and realize who we are and believe not only in ourselves but in each other. Because it is only through our coming together that we can begin to take Africa where Africa belongs. We can begin to stop the exploitation that Africa has been going through. And as long as we remain divided and colonized, garbage in, garbage out. I thank you.
Can you hear me? Oh. Okay, thank you, Madam Ambassador. This was a very impassioned speech, and your description of what Africa is and what it wants to become, I think, is wonderful, wonderful for Americans to hear. By the way, the ambassador mentioned the one French-speaking African country that refused to be part of the French orbit, which was Guinea. And the United States immediately had relations with Guinea at that moment when they broke with France. And ever since that time, the United States has a special relationship with Guinea. And I benefited from that myself. In 2009, I was representing a U.S. oil company trying to get an oil concession in Guinea. And we were in competition with a Chinese company. And after listening to our arguments, the Prime Minister of Guinea, who is an old guy like me, he says, I remember how you Americans came in after the French really were nasty to us. He says, I'm going to give this concession to the Americans. So sometimes diplomacy can play a good role in the economy, in competition for business. Also, I'd like to point out, of course, Madam Ambassador, you're talking about the colonial masters. Without saying it, you let everyone know that America was not a colonial master in Africa. Absolutely. We never had a colony in Africa. And I think it's important to know why. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson arranged the Louisiana Purchase. And at that time, instead of people looking to go to Africa, we could have done it. We had a blue water navy. Everybody started looking toward the West, settlement of the West. So that, I think, is the main reason why the United States never had a colony in Africa. Now, Liberia was born of the United States, but they were never our colony. They were an independent country right from the beginning. Well, Madam Ambassador, let me see if I can add to the conversation a bit. You know, we've been reading about the African Union in the American press in the last couple of weeks, kind of in a gossipy way, and they've been reporting that the Chinese company built your beautiful headquarters in Addis Ababa, really a very wonderful building. But now, according to some reports, the Chinese put listening devices in the walls. And so, Madam Ambassador, can you tell us, is this true?
Well, I've been asked this question so many times. Let me put it this way. These rumors have been going on long before even the foundation was dug, and they've continued. The reality is, let's suppose that they did put listening devices in the walls. By now, they are obsolete. We're sitting in this room right now with satellites and everything. They're reading your tablets. They're reading your cell phones. You don't need listening devices in the wall. So I think that French young man, journalist who wrote the article, well, good for him. It made news. But it wasn't news for us. That was old news. You don't need any device in the wall to spy on anybody today.
Good answer, good answer. Madam Ambassador, today the news announced that in the country of Burkina Faso is one of these Sahel countries just south of the Sahara, where there's, as the ambassador said, there have been terrorist attacks, terrorists coming down from Libya. Well, today, they began a trial of military officers who attempted a military coup 2 years ago. It was a military coup that did not succeed. So the question I have for you, Madam Ambassador, is our military coups finally over in Africa?
I can tell you, based on the African Union, yes, the military coups are over. For some of you, I'll take you back to the situation in Zimbabwe. The reason that was not officially a coup, the consequences of having a coup is immediate you'll be expelled from the AU. Many other consequences, even to the US government. So we no longer tolerate coups under no circumstances. Absolutely not.
Well, that's good news. That's very good news. Madam Ambassador, you mentioned that Africa produces a lot of commodities. You mentioned coffee, you mentioned cocoa, and all of these commodities are sold overseas, and then much of it is manufactured and processed and then sold back to Africa, especially food. I think you will agree with me that Africa has to import most of the food for the urban areas.
Sadly.
Right. So for the United States, this audience is very interested in United States policy. Would you say that a high priority for U.S. policy in Africa is to help develop agriculture so that the Africans do not have to import food with the money they get from their exported commodities?
As a matter of fact, our hope is that Africa becomes the breadbasket for the world. 60% of the arable land in the world is in Africa. It is absolutely inexcusable that Africa is importing food. Unacceptable, and it has got to end. Those are some of the issues that we have to own that. You know, when we look at something as easy as agriculture, why can't we get ourselves together on that? It's absolutely unacceptable. And I can understand why the young African youth are angry, because we are failing them even on some of the most basic situations. So no, Africa must not import food. We should be feeding the world. And so yes, the US is partnering with us to make sure that that is realized. It is absolutely unacceptable. And the leadership is working. It's becoming obvious that each country realizes that we most likely are going to end up with agricultural-led economic development. It has to be done. It is a low-hanging fruit for us in Africa.
Madam Ambassador, I have to correct one thing that you said. You said that Africa produces cocoa, but they don't make chocolate. But I'm a chocolate addict. I love dark chocolate. So I'm always looking around for the perfect chocolate bar. And I found one recently called Divine. And this chocolate is made in Ghana by an American company called Mars. Mars. So I'm correcting you there.
Thank you for the correction.
Okay. All right. When I talk to people about Africa based on my own experience, a question that I get frequently is, isn't China taking away all of U.S. influence in Africa? Isn't it undercutting all American economic interests in Africa? Aren't they really taking over Africa? I mean, you hear a lot of these questions. So, Madam Ambassador, could you give us some perspective on what the Chinese are doing in Africa?
Let me start by saying there was a time that there was that fear, because every time you turn around, there are Chinamen popping up everywhere. As a matter of fact, it was estimated that by 2050, we may have 300 million Chinese. China was paying its people to go to Africa and start businesses. You can Google Chinamen looking for African wives to marry. Their marriage is taking place all over the place. But I think when you look at somebody who is hungry and you need food today and you need food now, that's what happened in Africa. We were hungry, we needed food, we needed money. And so, like one president put it, he said, well, the difference is you go to the West looking for funding, they make you jump through hoops. China says how much with the checkbook in hand. But I think that phase is over now. We're beginning to see what's been happening. Chinese, they brought their own laborers and all that. That is slowly changing to where now companies have got to employ local people. Africa is beginning to pull back. And we realize even infrastructure developments that were done by the Chinese, back then, they're falling apart. The buildings. Now, the African Union building is pretty solid, I have to say. That may be an exception. But in general, people feel that Chinese products are of poor quality. And now the shift is back towards the United States. And the truth be told, there is no way any country on earth could replace the United States in Africa. I never thought actually that the United States could replace Britain. Britain used to be it all. I remember growing up in Africa, if you were educated in America, they thought, oh, you bought your degree, because no self-respecting father would send their child to America. You gotta be educated in Oxford, and you gotta go to Britain. That pendulum has completely swung the other way. America is the ally for Africa. Let's make no mistake about it. And I'm here to say, I'm going to see to it that the relationship between Africa and the United States is the best relationship Africa has with any country in the world.
So, according to the most recent summit conference that you mentioned that took place in January, there will be a special meeting in March to establish an Africa-wide common market. Do you sincerely feel that it's going to be possible to have total open borders where goods could move and people can move without restriction? Do you think that can really be accomplished?
As a matter of fact, I think it can. I am surprised at the pace at which the developments are taking place. For example, the African passport. It was talked about, next summit, voted and approved. Now the African passport is available. Now there's more and more talk because the reality is on the ground. Let's look at agriculture. You go to the market, we're wasting so much food for a continent that needs the food simply because of border issues. And so the realities on the ground are dictating that we have to come together. You take minor situations like, let's take a country like, say, South Africa. There is a road that goes and it stops 5 kilometers from Botswana. Then Botswana starts maybe 5 kilometers into its country. And then it goes about 5 kilometers from Angola. Well, Angola picks up the same road, maybe another 5 kilometers into its country. And all it would take is just link those roads. 5 kilometers of road for this country, 5 kilometers of... So slowly, it's coming together, the common sense to say, guys, we can do this. If we were to link up all the power lines in Africa today, we would provide power to an additional 30 megawatts of power. In the process, save billions of dollars without one single penny spent, only linking the existing power lines. So they're beginning to be realistic and see the insanity of having one country, which is a net exporter of power, next door to a country which is a net importer of power. So those are some of just ridiculous things that have been going on the continent. And thankfully and gratefully, that the leaders are beginning to see it and say, this is nonsense. We must stop the insanity.
Speaking of power, I have to boast a little bit now. I've been working for a U.S. company that invests in power generation. What they do is they build power plants and just sell the electricity under an agreement that lasts 20 years. And the African host country does not have to invest anything. All they have to do is agree to buy the electricity, which of course is something they need. So there are 4 power plants in Africa now with my name on it. Togo, Rwanda, Nigeria, and we just opened one in Senegal a year ago, so I'm quite proud of that.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Okay, now I think we'll open it to the audience. I'm sure they have a lot of questions. So please use the microphone on the side and line up there. And please ask a question, do not make a speech.
Well, first, I'd like to express my deep regret at your introduction to Jamaica. I am originally from Jamaica. And
Speak up, please.
I do regret your introductory visit to Jamaica. I am originally from Jamaica, and Jamaica is known as a pioneer for justice, equality, and the aspirations that, level the barriers between peoples. So I regret that your experience in Jamaica your introduction to Jamaica was as you described it. Ambassador Cohen, I have never met you, but learned of you during a tour in Angola, and I was told that you are known for this famous quote. You said that the Angolans never lost an opportunity to lose an opportunity. And someone recounted that to me as I struggled to bring the parties together in a national reconciliation initiative. I wonder if I could have both of your perspectives on the new president of Angola and what you think are the prospects for his success in his aspirations for his country. Thank you.
Well, let me start by saying, first and foremost, my bosses are the 55 African Union, African leaders, for starters. But secondly, like any other democracy, if we're talking about democracy, may the best men win. So the one who won the presidency, we have to give them the full support. We can't begin to be doubting Thomases. We have to give them the full support because remember, a leader is as good as the people behind them. So if we don't give them the support that they need in order to do the things that we want done, that's where we lose. So we're glad that they had a democratic change of government. For that, we're grateful. And we're going to give the president all the support that he needs to do the work that he needs to be doing. So time will tell.
Well, I had the pleasure of meeting the new president of Angola, Lorenzo. He was here about 18 months ago. He was Minister of Defense at the time, and there was no indication that he was going to be the next president, although some people were thinking about that. I found him to be very pragmatic. He was really interested in economic development and in good governance. And I think his first actions since he became president bear that out. With President Dos Santos, government tended to be a family affair. His daughter, Isabel, was placed in very high positions, and his son as well. Lorenzo is more of a good government type of person. And I'm optimistic because he's there. By the way, I have a little story to tell you about Isabel. Dos Santos' daughter is reputed to be the richest woman in Africa. I don't know if that's true or not, but President Dos Santos came to the United States for the first time to meet President George H.W. Bush in 1990. And he brought his daughter Isabel, who was then 18 years of age. She was going to college in the U.S. And she was very, very cute. And in he comes with his daughter into the Oval Office. And President Bush just melted. Here, sit in my chair, use the phone. He just was in love with that girl. So anyway, that caused our relations with Angola to go way up. Really terrific. So sometimes the personal aspect is important. Yes, next question.
My name is Li Yang. First, maybe allow me to ask you to re-evaluate the quality of Chinese product. The way you said at the beginning is poor, not as good as any other developing country. But the problem is at that time their technology is not that good. But now you got to consider their product is very good. That's why everywhere in the United States, merchandise are made in China. Second is, I wonder, democracy is good only when the people participate and they have a voice to be heard. But that is not true in many advanced countries, including the United States. And you will see a lot of non-voters. They don't want to vote because their complaint, their issue never been resolved. So I just wonder if the African Union, are they going to have a total democracy, the fake democracy, or are they going to do maybe something like Confucius, the kind of concept that everybody have a high integrity and good for everybody else rather than so selfish. Everything is sort of like profit about people. So I just want to know if you have that kind of concept rather than just as a follow like advanced country, that is not really a good advanced concept. That's already behind a century old. That's really savage. to the normal people, maybe in Africa, maybe your concept that is just about the same as animals.
Thank you.
Well, I can say, I'll add to your comment, your initial comment, to say Chinese products have gotten better. We see that happening too in Africa. It's improving. So you're quite right about that. Like I said, the African Union building is a pretty solid building. Then coming to democracy and good governance, thank you for bringing that up. You're giving me an opportunity to say this blanket painting of Africa as a continent with lack of democracy and good governance. That's just not true at all. We have many African countries that are doing well, but we take a few that are not doing well, leaders who are not doing well by their people, leaders who are not observing good governance and democracy. We need to single them out and talk about those countries individually rather than talk about it as a continental problem, because it is not. So yes, those countries that need to do better, we now have a process called, it's a voluntary process where the heads of states meet twice a year to talk about the progress in their own countries using the Agenda 23, right, peer review mechanism, yes. I have been privileged to sit in a room. I think right now we have about 40 countries that have signed up for the peer review. It's voluntary. But I've listened to the heads of states get up one by one, give an assessment, their own self-assessment of the progress they have made in their own countries. And every one of them given themselves a failing grade, but made a commitment to do better. That's huge. That did not used to happen. So we are moving in the right direction. But it goes back to saying, like I always ask, 54 years later, we are yet to build that perfect union. It takes time. It's 55 different countries that have gone through a lot, different experiences. So how you deal with one country, the issues as to how this country got where it is are different from why this country is where it is. So getting that common position is not easy. But again, like I said, we are moving at a pace now that we are beginning to see a true light at the end of the tunnel, not an oncoming train.
Thank you. I just want to say I've been watching Africa from the very beginning, and when they all started, they all had what they called a one-party state. Only one party authorized, no opposition allowed. Well, this is all gone. I don't think there's a single one-party state in Africa that's left. They all have multi-party systems. So there's a great deal of progress that is being made toward democracy. And remember, democracy is not an election. Democracy is a process. Even the United States, democracy here is a lot different from what it was in 1789. It's not the same. Okay, next question.
Madam Ambassador, thank you for coming. And when African Union was a big thing, I was in Africa, in actually Botswana. I lived in Africa for 7 years, speak 3 African languages there. And I have some properties left in Victoria Falls, actually, in Zimbabwe.
Beautiful place.
Yes. I have 2 questions. First question is, I loved Gaddafi. I know it's very controversial to say that, there was no employment. The country was having a positive balance, as an economy. And when outside forces came in, African Union did not do anything. That was sad. An African leader was taken on the streets and killed. What are you going to do as African Union to get some teeth in the defense processes of the continent? That's the first question.
I'm glad you asked that question. And if the truth be told, the African Union was not pleased with the manner in which the UN Security Council voted to take out Saddam in the manner that they did. The African Union had a plan. Zuma, President Zuma of South Africa, had already accepted him for asylum. Plans were underway to talk to Gaddafi for him to move to South Africa. So yes, the decision to take out Gaddafi went against the wishes of the African Union. We wished things had been handled a little differently. You're quite right. I think, but when you're coming up against more powerful forces, again, it goes back to Africa taking its rightful place on the world stage. But AU was clearly opposed to the manner in which Gaddafi was taken out without a plan for replacement, which is what led us to the Libya that we have today.
My second question, black racism on white. I've seen farms being taken over by Mugabe forces, the ZANU-PF people. What is the African Union doing to, when we talk about racism from Africa and we bash colonists, and we actually are doing that to their citizens right there, what are you going to do to recompensate and rehabilitate those citizens who have been there for 4 generations, 5 generations? What is African Union going to do for that?
Okay, I like the fact that you're putting a timeline there. See, with history, we have a tendency to say, well, let's start the story from here moving forward. But let's not talk about the story going back. In Zimbabwe, you have to say, how did we get there? Let me take 1 minute and summarize it for you. When the British came to Zimbabwe, they analyzed the country and divided it into 4 regions. Region 1 was the best soil, the best rains, best conditions for farming. Region 2, pretty close to Region 1. Region 3, there were some areas there, the soil was not so good, and the rain was good, but not the best. Region 4, no rain. The soil was horrible, mosquitoes and sesaflies. So they set out a plan. If you were an adventurous British, a veteran of the First or Second World War, you were guaranteed 2,000 hectares. Hectares, multiply 2,000 by 2.2. You were guaranteed that much in Zimbabwe, plus any loot from the local people. So a British man would land in Zimbabwe. So based on the regions that they had decided, they were going to move all the black people, preferably from the region 1 and 2 to region 4. So the process started. And how did a British map up their land? You got on a horse, they'll tell you this region. Get on a horse, and you ride in one direction for a day until either you or your horse were tired. You put your bag. Tomorrow morning, you do the same thing. So it took 4 days for the Englishman to map up his land. At the end of the 4 days, everything in it is yours. And the people who lived on that land were told, in this direction, go past this mountain. In this direction, go past this river. They left with whatever they could carry. The chickens, the goats, the cows, they were theirs. And some of them were not so lucky. You're barely settled again when another Englishman came, and he was given that part. And there you were again. Slowly, the process of moving black people to the west parts of the country started, and it was finally completed in the 50s. Now, you want to ask me who needs to be compensated? Are you with me?
Yes.
So we got to go to the beginning rather than understanding things superficially. How did you get your hand? It just goes about how fast you could go. Some of these farmers were owning 5, 6, 7 farms. I know my family farm, and I grew up hearing the story from my own father. When the situation took place in the case of my father, he remembers distinctly he was a teenager. And he used to, when white men came to Africa with their pants, they called them men without knees. He remembers men without knees coming to the village on horses. There was some hush-hush talk. He didn't know what was going on. But he remembers waking up one morning and the whole village was on fire. They were being torched by these men without knees on horses. His aunt was pregnant and was due any day. So they had asked for permission for her to stay until she delivers. It was one little hut that was left standing in a burnt-out village. They left with whatever they could carry. Sadly for them, Aunt didn't deliver for 3 weeks. My father spoke about how scared he was every morning. The men without knees coming to check and see if my aunt had delivered. There was him, an uncle, another grandmother who was a midwife, and another aunt. They all crumbled up in this one room. When she finally delivered, 3 days after delivery, they were told to walk, go find the others who had left before. Now the loot law, it's in the history books. You don't have to go far. It's in the British history books. As a matter of fact, the British started fighting themselves over how to distribute the loot as they go from one place, one village to the other. It was acceptable. So, son, do you still want to ask me who is owed what? May I rest my case?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
But those people still have families. We need to be compassionate.
Thank you.
Those people still have families too. I do have families. And when I go home and they're still in Region 4, I got a problem with that.
Thank you. Just to expand a bit from the ambassador's very passionate statement, land tenure is an extremely important issue in every African country. And until that is modernized, it will be very, very difficult to have modern agriculture. And in some countries, the land belongs to the state, and the farmer is there maybe for his whole life, but he never owns it. So land tenure, it's an extreme case in Zimbabwe, but in every country, land tenure is a major issue that you don't read much about. Next.
Good evening, Madam Ambassador.
Good evening.
Ambassador Cohen, thank you so much for providing this platform to discuss African affairs. Like you stated earlier, Madam Ambassador, Africa is the richest continent. I fully agree with you on that. And we do see this resurgence of a scramble of Africa from China, India, and of course the Western nations. And my family is from Kenya. I spent some time in Kenya in 2010. And what I noticed is that the Chinese did wonderful infrastructure projects in Kenya that really helped revitalize the streets, etc. However, I also noticed that many Kenyans are also very qualified to do the same type of jobs, such as engineering, construction work, etc., but we're just unemployed. So I'm wondering, what is the African Union doing to maybe like a policy change for the continent, where you do have the Chinese coming in and doing infrastructure projects, but they're also employing the youth? Because you see in Kenya, for example, the youth is very educated, but they're unemployed. So if you're unemployed, you'll get involved in things that are not good for the society that we all frown upon. So what can the African Union do to, yes, bring the Chinese in, or whoever, the Western, from France, from Britain, but also employ the people, the youth in particular?
Your point is well taken, and like I mentioned earlier, we are actually seeing a change in the attitude. Now Chinese companies are being made to hire the locals, because that has been a problem. I'm not sure why it took so long to begin to do the pullback, but now, yes, absolutely, they are required to hire locals, and also train locals. But at the same time, I go back to say, even we as diaspora, rather than sit here in America and other parts of the world and shoot out complaints, there's a role that we can play. But because we are not coming together as Africans, individually, we are groups of people who are sending, I think formally, anywhere from $50 to $60 billion into Africa. Informally, estimates say over $100 billion. And yet, we can't come together. If we were to come together and get that money into Africa in an organized way, Africa does not even need the aid. We can change our own circumstances. So at some point, while we are trying to figure out what we need to do, we must first and foremost own what we need to own and take responsibility for that which we can do for ourselves. So for that one, my sister, I'll take it back to you to say, rather than complain about the Chinese, what have you done for Africa?
Thank you. I just make one point about the Chinese. One thing they'll never do is to have senior management among the Africans. If you go to Angola, Chevron Corporation in Angola producing 2 million barrels a day, the CEO is an African. You'll never see that in a Chinese company. But I agree with the ambassador. The African governments are taking charge more and more in making sure the Chinese employ Africans rather than Chinese in a lot of their companies. Next question.
Hello. Sorry for my voice, a little raspy today. Thank you.
Better than me.
Yeah. Thank you for coming to speak to us today. And my question deals with the Nile River, and more specifically, I'd be interested to know what your stance is, and then collectively what the AU stance is on the conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia over the Nile, and to what degree is the African Union concerned when General Sisi says that he's willing to utilize the Egyptian military to further Egyptian interest over the Nile?
You know, it's one of those situations that you say to yourself, again, back to common sense, with especially those two countries. What about solar? It's all about power, and the two countries are fighting over water. What about solar? There's no need for that. So there's been something tabled to say, we build solar plants that'll provide the amount of power that Ethiopia needs and the amount of power that Egypt needs. Let's let the rivers be, because there are options. Because otherwise, that's a war you can't win. There won't be any winners there. It's a loss for Ethiopia, it's a loss for Egypt. So the option is solar. And I've heard that conversation as a way of addressing the issue between the two countries.
Thank you. Next.
Hello, my name's Kensi Pukuta, representing KP Empire and Chris Consulting. I had the pleasure of meeting Her Excellency at the African Growth Initiative, the Brookings event, and I was very inspired by her response to my question. I want to thank both of you guys for being here. So my question is, in respect to the quote you mentioned in the very beginning, you're not African because you're born in Africa, rather you're African because Africa is born in you. And as a young African born here in the U.S., I am truly proud and blessed to be able to trace my roots directly through my parents, in particular Congo-Brazzaville. So my question is, how can I start awakening some people, some of my fellow peer Africans who can trace their roots to Africa but are truly confused because of slavery or colonialism and don't have the privilege of visiting Africa, having African relatives and such?
Now, I take it your parents are continental Africans?
Yes.
Now, you have a very special situation. You are like my children. I used to apologize to my children all the time to say, when you are at home, you are in Africa. Because I'm raising my children the only way that I know how, which is how my parents raised me. But when you step foot outside Africa, you're in America. So every day, you're having to make that journey and that transition. And I'm sure you know, some of you young ones, when you get together and you start talking about the dumb things your parents do, the dumb things your aunts do, and how they can't speak English. But we are raising you the only way we know how. So for you to have made that journey and successfully ended up the way you are, we say thank you and congratulations. The issues of African diaspora. As you may be aware, the African Union recognizes that for true sustainable change to come to Africa, it's going to need to involve the African diaspora. And the African diaspora, by African Union definition, is all people of African descent living outside Africa. That means those who were forcibly brought here in chains, and those who came here later in search of greener pastures. But be it as it may, we're calling on the Africans to come together. That's why I'm here. The quandary for most heads of states is, while we want the African diaspora to look back home, how do we go about it? It goes back again to the divisions among us. So it is really just imperative that we begin to work together as the African diaspora, a united African diaspora, just like the Jews do. You can walk into Jewish embassy, I'm told, and before age 18 and say, I'm a Jew, I want to go home. You get a round trip ticket home. That's what people do when they believe in themselves. Because we don't expect you kids to know Africa by osmosis, by bumping into me. We have to put together a plan as Africans to say, game is over. Something has got to give. How do we expect our children? And believe me, I'm doing my part to bring us together. So I'm counting on you to join us.
Thank you. Thank
and
you.
Start by visiting your Africa House on 1640 Wisconsin Avenue.
Thank you. I have a bit of an anecdote. I was a diplomat in Uganda, and my son was born there. And a couple of years ago, I saw the president of Uganda, and I said, Mr. President, I never told you my son was born there. He said, tell him to come and buy land, because only people born in Uganda have the right to buy land. So there's all sorts of rules about things. Next question.
Good evening, Madam Ambassador. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Daniel Zaire, and since the signing of the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court has been one of the greatest success stories for international justice. But we've seen within the last year or so, there's a number of African Union member states that have shown intent to leave the International Criminal Court because of a perceived bias against African war criminals when compared to war criminals from elsewhere. What do you, every individual to stand trial in the ICC has been African. What is your comment on that, and what is your comment on the fact that a lot of AU member states wish to leave the ICC?
Well, I think they do need to leave the ICC because there is a bias. Africa needs to have its own criminal court, and that is in the works. It is that simple.
Is that simple?
It is that simple.
Why hasn't there been anyone from Myanmar indicted by the ICC?
Absolutely.
It's kind of strange that only Africans get indicted.
Instead of leaving the ICC, shouldn't the Africans, obviously they voice their concerns, but shouldn't they work towards a better ICC where more individuals from, not more individuals, but you know what I mean, where individuals who are indicted aren't only African, because there are plenty of war criminals who walk free.
Africa needs to have its own ICC. Africa must take care of itself. Simple.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, Mr. Cohen. And also thank you for everybody for being here and asking great questions. I think you would have made a great lawyer, because when you make your case, it's almost irrefutable. Well, one of the things that you do is you use stories very well. Stories are important because they give context. They tell you about the history. They tell you about your failures, your successes. More importantly, they inspire you.
as Africans, I don't think we've done a good job telling our stories. I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria, and I read Oliver Twist's Pride and Prejudice. Didn't learn much about, Nkrumah or the great African leaders that came before my time. And I had to search myself. I mean, everybody here has probably seen a movie about the Holocaust or, the Alamo, but there hasn't been a real movie about what you just described that happened in Zimbabwe. So how can the world put context around what is going on in Africa? How can we inspire the youth in Africa to think that it's possible to overcome the challenges? I'm not asking for us to hide those things. That's part of our story now. More importantly, in more concrete sense, what is the African Union doing in terms of educational policies to try to shift this a little bit so that African youths can actually learn about their heritage, their story at a very young age to inspire change that we really need to come in the future?
I think you made a very important point, that Africa has got to take charge of its own narrative. We must tell our own story. I like to call it the they syndrome. Again, goes back to Berlin Conference, 1885. We are waiting for them to do this. We are waiting for them to do. Who is they? Who is them? Our colonized mind is the white man. What's stopping us from telling our own stories? Things are happening around us. We are waiting for somebody to tell the story. That we must own. So we must tell our own stories, we must tell our own narrative. What I've done in my own power here at the AU Mission in Washington, D.C., we've now set up an internet, television, and radio. We hope that we will be telling the truth about Africa from there. So if you want to hear the truth, just tune in and we'll tell you the truth. So you don't have to now begin to say, oh, what did BBC say? What did CNN say? Because we don't tell our own narrative. I want to tell you something very funny. It happened in Zimbabwe, and I was, during that difficult time, I was in my house in Harare, and I'm watching CNN, and there were all these black people stealing, they're carrying refrigerators, they're pushing cars, they're carrying televisions, and I said, oh, there's chaos in Zimbabwe. Black people are stealing from white people. And I was just like, wow, where is this happening? I'm here. Well, the following day, I found out it was in some remote parts of Zimbabwe, up in the farms. 10 farmers had gotten together, and they needed to have some publicity. So they got their own workers to come and act like they were stealing from them. How do you steal a car? By pushing it. How do you steal a refrigerator when you live in a hut with no electricity? It didn't make any sense. There was no context to it. So I'm told the police said, okay, you guys are thieves. They came and rounded all of them. The CNN helicopters got there even before the local police could get there. It was all staged. So the police knew that if they rounded all these workers, those are the same workers who take care of the house and the children and the farms. Now suddenly the farmers, they can't do it because all the workers were locked up. Well, where were the CNN helicopters when now the same farmers were lined up to bail these people? So for a week, the police refused to give them. They said, these people are thieves. We saw it on television. But nobody talks about that because we don't have the means to tell our own story. And we have to own that. It is our problem, and we've got to do better. When it comes to our youth, again, back to job creation, improving the economy, encouraging the entrepreneurs. Those are now conversations that are taking place pretty much in all governments. Women empowerment and youth empowerment are at the top of the agenda for the African Union, even for the African leaders as well, because it is through our youth that Africa can sustain itself. So you're quite right. We got work to do, but it's going to take all of us coming together, speaking with one voice.
Hello. So Morocco rejoined the AU last year, and the AU and Morocco have conflicting views over the sovereignty of Western Sahara. And, frankly, what Morocco is doing in Western Sahara is colonization. They're the last colonizers in Africa. And I'm wondering how the AU is going to use this opportunity to, restart a dialogue over, remedying this situation.
Well, let me say, I was there when the voting took place for Morocco to come back to the Union. Keep in mind, the reason Morocco left first is because they huffed and puffed, either you do this or else, where the African countries said, well, we'll go or else, because we are going to observe the Sahrawi Republic. When they tried to come back previously, it's been with conditions. But I still remember the voting was going on, and other countries spoke up and said their conditions were not going to vote on it. So they wanted to push the can down the road again so it could be voted another time, which had been going on for quite a while. And I still remember President Mugabe, who always looks like he's asleep. Well, he comes to life and he says, well, the Moroccans are here. Tell them to go outside. If they can remove the conditions, we can vote on it. He goes back to sleep. And so the Moroccans go outside, they remove the conditions, and then they come back, and of course, Mugabe wakes up again and says, okay, now we can vote on it. It was voted on, and the majority of the African countries felt that if Morocco is willing to come back without any conditions, it's about time the African family becomes whole again. I still remember, even after the majority had said Morocco should come back, there were still some countries who were still against it. But Zuma got up and he said, I'll be very honest with you, I voted against Morocco coming back. But we can't talk about democracy out there if we can practice democracy at the African Union. The majority has got to rule. And so that's how Morocco came back in, because they took out the conditions. So now moving forward, the issue we have is to now say, how does the Peace and Security Department at the AU continue to come up with an amicable solution, but the conditions that they wanted previously, which were really making it mission impossible, were removed. So that was a big start. So that is work in progress. And it saddens us really as Africans to see that situation continue. But the African Union also has that at the top of the agenda.
Thank you. Last question of the evening.
Good evening, Ambassador.
Good evening.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Kalunga Caroline. I come from Zambia in Southern Africa. I'm going to ask you two questions. My first question was born out of the comment that His Excellency made on democracy in Africa. I think that democracy in Africa, from a bigger picture, when you're far from Africa, looks like everything is fine. But when you're actually on the ground, it's a different story. I'll give an account of my neighboring country, Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. I have a privilege of working with the young people and women of the rural communities. And one of my friends from Congo invited me for a conference on peace building among the young people. And I must say that the Congo is a country that really needs the help of the AU. And if the AU does not do anything about the situation in Congo, then the rest of us as the neighbors of Congo are going to be affected. My country is very much affected by the wars in Congo and everything that's going on. We have a lot of refugees coming in the country every day. The border is very porous, and who knows if the rebels will come into my country or not. So you find that the Congolese people have been expecting elections, I think, for 5 years now, and the elections never came, yet the Congo is seen to be a democratic country. So my question is, what is the AU doing about it? One of the main opposition leaders of the Congo is currently in exile, if I'm not mistaken, Moses Katumbi. And the elections have been put on hold because the one ruling party wants to still continue being in power, and nothing is being done about it.
Well, the GRC is a very special case. As a matter of fact, when you look at the issues to do with democracy, good governance, you look at issues that are internal and issues that are external. If you ever happen to fly low over the DRC, you're going to find tarmacs in the middle of the jungle. There are planes landing and taking off, coming in to pick up minerals in the DRC, right outside the country, and pick up and leave. That's corruption. Do you think those companies that are doing that would like to see any peace and security in DRC? Of course not. I often talk about, when we're talking about issues of peace and security and governance in Africa, sometimes we concentrate on the monkeys and the squirrels in the room when the 10,000-pound gorilla is sitting in the middle. DRC is going to be a tough nut to crack because of the wealth that DRC has. So much outside influence, multinationals that are interested in what they can get. As long as DRC remains unstable, they can continue to exploit DRC. So what changes does DRC stand in terms of trying to have true democracy and good governance? I'm not saying Kabila must not go. We are glad now that Kabila has agreed and he has reiterated his commitment to elections on the 23rd of December. And the AU is holding him to it. But even then, we become skeptical to say, even when all that is done, the new leader has to be acutely aware of the forces that will be working against him or her. So some of those realities, we must also look at them head on and make sure that whatever strategy that gets put in place addressing the issues of Africa, let's look at forces from outside as well as the forces from within. Because tackling issues only from inside is not going to resolve the problems. So yes, you're right, DRC is a challenge, and it's a multifactorial issue.
I'd like to say that we think that the African Union made a fantastic choice in sending you here. You're really a great ambassador.